The chessboard is a map of a battlefield. Roads connect the various areas of conflict, and the center of the board is the high ground. Control of this area is critical. The names we use for the pieces of a chess set were invented during the Middle Ages, when countries were ruled by kings and queens. Kings and queens, of course, lived in castles. They had bishops to give them advice and courageous knights to defend them. In times of war, the peasants often took up arms and helped to defend the kingdom. When you play chess, you are the ruler of your kingdom, defending your own troops and territory as your army seeks to attack your opponent's king. You'll face many dangers and endless complications as you and your troops set off in pursuit of a king.
In Pursuit of a King, an introduction to the game of chess, presented by the United States Chess Federation. Participating in this program, Don Maddox, editor of Chess Life magazine, and Vince McCambridge, international chess master and assistant director of the United States Chess Federation. Your host is David Mathau.
Chess is an ancient game, yet as new as tomorrow's technology. You can sit at your own chess board or over your computer terminal in the comfort of your own home and enjoy a friendly game of chess with someone on the other side of the country, literally chess coast to coast. In fact, the United States Chess Federation uses the leisure-linked unit you see here to conduct some official championship events. The game continues to grow in popularity, and the reason is simple. Chess is fun. Chess has created national heroes and international celebrities. It's played in a wide variety of settings, from casual coffee table competition to formal tournament play. It's played by people of all ages, between people of all ages, anywhere and everywhere in the world. Chess is fun, a fascinating game you can learn to play in a surprisingly short time. In fact, by the end of this program, you should know the basic rules of the game. And you'll know quite a bit about strategy, too. The basic strategy you'll learn will help you win games against chess players who have had years of experience. These strategic tips are really the basic winning secrets of the chess masters. With practice, you can sharpen your skills and be on your way to mastering the most intriguing and unpredictable game the world has ever known. The basic object of chess is to force the enemy king into a position in which he is threatened with capture by one of your men and is unable to escape. Without a king to lead the army, the battle and the game are over. You'll probably try to capture some of the enemy's chessmen in order to make it easier to reach your opponent's king. Meanwhile, you'll be doing your best to defend your king at all times. To move one of your men, just pick it up and set it down on the square you want to move to. Each square can have only one man on it at a time. If you want to move to a square where an enemy man stands, you can do so by capturing that man. When you capture, you replace your opponent's man with your own, and you take the enemy man off the board. Captured men stay off the board for the rest of the game. A pawn might capture a bishop like this, while a bishop could capture a queen like this. Each player starts with an army of 16 pieces. The king, tall and proud, is the most important chessman in your army. During the Middle Ages, the king was sometimes considered the spiritual head of the country. That's why, to this day, he often wears a cross on his crown. Each player has only one king. If he's lost, the rest of the army gives up too. Now, the thing that makes chess such an interesting game is that each chessman moves in a different way. Since nothing is more important than the king's safety, he must be very careful. He can move in any direction, forward, backward, sideways, or diagonally, but only one square at a time. In this illustration, the white king can move to any of the highlighted squares. You might think of the king's possible directions of movement as a small star. You can never put two men on one square, so even a king cannot move to a square where one of his own men is already standing. If the enemy occupies a square that the king can move to, the king can capture the enemy man. Before we discuss the other pieces, let's take a closer look at the board itself. A chessboard has 64 squares colored light and dark. When you sit down to play, it's important that you have a light square on your right. Light on your right. Rows running north and south are the files. Each has its own name. The A file, B file, C file, and so on, all the way through H. Rows of squares running east to west are the ranks, and each has its own name. The numbers, 1 through 8. The board is always labeled from the white's point of view, so regardless of which side you may be sitting on, the third rank would be here, and the C file here. The slanted rows are the diagonals. Notice that all of the squares in a diagonal are of the same color. Each square is a crossroad, and each has its own name, a letter-number combination that pinpoints the square's location by file and rank. The highlighted square is on the C file in the 4th rank, so the name of that square is C4. The queen is the king's trusted partner. They stand side by side, she wearing her coronet. The queen is greatly feared because it's the strongest of all the chess pieces. Each player starts with only one queen. The queen can move in straight lines, along a rank, a file, or a diagonal, frontward, backward, or sideways. You might think of the queen's possible directions of movement as a large star. She can move as many squares as she wants, as long as nothing gets in her way. It doesn't matter whether a friendly man or enemy man gets in the way, the queen cannot jump over it. If an enemy man stands on a square that a queen can move to, she can capture the enemy piece. The king is of infinite value. When the king is under attack and cannot escape, the result is checkmate. When the king is under attack and has a possible escape, we call it check. A king can never voluntarily step into check. For example, in this position, neither king can move next to the other, since that would be moving into check. Such a move would be illegal. In this position, the white queen will move to a square from which she checks the black king along the rank. Black must now move the king out of check. He cannot stop to do anything else. Look at this position. The phantom chess computer by Fidelity is about to play a move. The white king restrains the black king, and when the queen moves down to the first rank, checkmate is the result. The rooks look like towers or castles, standing guard at the corners of the kingdom. It usually takes the rooks a while before they get into the battle. But once they begin to move, they're extremely powerful weapons, capable of doing great damage. They're second only to the queen in strength. Each player starts with 2 rooks. The rook can move along any rank or file, any number of squares in a straight line, forward, backward, and sideways. The highlighted area shows all the squares this rook can move to. You might think of the rook's possible directions of movement as making a cross. A rook can move as many squares as it wants, as long as nothing gets in its way. Be it friend or foe, if another chess man gets in the way, the rook cannot jump over it. If an enemy man stands on a square that a rook can move to, the rook can capture the enemy piece. Queens and rooks are considered the major pieces. Here's an example of how the two of them can cooperate for an endgame checkmate. On an open board, they are powerful attacking pieces. This position, in which the black king is in check from the white rook, gives us an opportunity to learn more about check. With more on this, here is Vince McCambridge.
There are three general ways to escape check. The first is to move the king. Here, the black king can get out of check by moving up one square. Note that he can't move down, since the queen controls that rank. A second way to get out of check is to block the check. The black rook could intervene by moving here. The third way of escaping check is to capture the checking piece. Here, the black queen could capture the rook. It's likely that the white queen would capture back, again placing the king in check. We'll see later that the exchange of queen for rook would not be an appetizing one for black.
Chess is a game with a long-standing tradition of courtesy, so you'll never actually capture and take your opponent's king. The game is over as soon as the enemy king has no possible legal move left and simply cannot escape. Players may concede anytime they feel defeat is inevitable, just as one general may concede to another to avoid senseless waste. It's also possible to play to a draw. There are times when equally matched armies are either at a standoff or could conceivably play on indefinitely. In these cases, the game is declared a tie or draw, sometimes by agreement and sometimes by special rules.
The simplest draw results when insufficient material is left on the board to force a checkmate. In this position, we have only two kings left on the board, neither of which can legally approach the other. Neither side can force checkmate, and the game results in a draw.
Another example of a draw is the stalemate. In this position, it is black's turn to move. The white king and queen surround the black king. Notice that the black king has no legal moves. Black has no other pieces to move. The game is a draw by stalemate.
The bishops are quick and nimble. At the start of the game, one bishop stands next to the king, the other next to the queen, each ready to whisper into a royal ear. Each is allowed to move only on squares of one color, traveling diagonally across the board. The bishop that starts on a light square must stay on the light squares throughout the entire game. The one that starts on the dark squares must stay on the dark squares. A bishop can move any number of squares along a diagonal, either forward or backward. The highlighted area shows the squares the bishops can move to. You might think of the bishop's possible directions of movement as an X. He can move as many squares as he wants as long as nothing gets in his way. A bishop cannot jump over another chessman. It doesn't matter whether a friendly man or an enemy man gets in his way. The bishop cannot jump over it. If an enemy chessman stands on a square that a bishop can move to, the bishop can capture the enemy piece. Because of their agility, it's considered good strategy to develop the bishops early in the game. In the Middle Ages, knights traveled on horseback. That's why today a knight chessman is represented by a horse. Each player starts with 2 knights. Knights are daring chessmen. They think nothing of boldly jumping right into the heart of the battle. In fact, they're the only chessmen who can literally jump over other pieces, friend and foe alike. The knight can move forward, backward, or sideways, always jumping from a square of one color to a square of the opposite color. To move a knight, just remember, 1, 2. 1 square on a rank, then 2 on a file, or 1 square on a file, then 2 squares on a rank. 1, 2. The knight's move can be thought of as an L. An L that can be turned on its side and upside down as well. The highlighted area shows all the squares this knight can move to. Notice how the possibilities create a circle. A knight can be completely surrounded and still be able to move. Although the knight can jump over other chessmen, he does not capture a man he jumps over. While the bishops always remain on the same color, knights change color with every move. A knight cannot move to a square where a friendly man already stands. And if an enemy man does stand on a square that a knight can move to, the knight can capture the enemy piece. The knight travels in slow steps, but he can usually get to where he wants to go. While bishops may be able to travel faster, knights can sometimes go where bishops can't. It's good strategy to develop knights and bishops early, moving them toward the center of the board so they can help to control the key areas of action. The center of the board is this area of 16 squares. During the Middle Ages, when a war was declared, everyone helped defend the kingdom. Sometimes the peasants would leave their fields to become foot soldiers. In chess, the pawns are your foot soldiers, small but very, very important. They line up in front of the army and are generally the first to make contact with the enemy. Each player starts with 8 pawns. The pawn's move is the simplest move of all, 1 square straight ahead. They never retreat, never move back. On its first move only, each pawn can move forward either 1 or 2 squares. It's up to the player to decide. In this illustration, the white pawn has already made its first move. So from now on, it can move only 1 square at a time. The black pawn is still on its starting square. It can move either 1 or 2 squares. The pawn is different from other chessmen in one very important way. A pawn cannot capture an enemy man that gets directly in its way. You see, in the Middle Ages, some foot soldiers carried shields for protection and stuck out their spears at an angle when approaching the enemy. And that's just what the pawn does in chess. The pawn attacks and captures diagonally ahead. For instance, here the white rook is in the black pawn's way. The pawn cannot move forward and cannot capture the rook. The pawn is stuck. Here, the white pawn cannot move forward because the black pawn is in the way. But the white pawn can capture either the black rook or the black bishop. The pawn captures the rook and takes it square. If a pawn makes it all the way to the other side of the board, he's rewarded with a promotion. He can become a queen, rook, knight, or bishop. Usually the pawn becomes a queen since the queen is the strongest of all chess pieces. Although promoted, the pawn must wait its turn to move. However, a newly promoted pawn assumes its greater powers immediately. For example, here it's White's turn to move. White decides to promote the B pawn by moving it to B8. Once the white pawn has been promoted to queen, the new white queen now has the black king in checkmate. The king is threatened by the enemy queen, but he's blocked from escape by his own pawns. The game is over. A special kind of pawn capture is called en passant, or in passing. It's not unusual to find casual chess players who have never heard of en passant. Originally, chess pawns could move only one square forward. Then about 500 years ago, in order to speed up the game, the two-square first move was introduced. Since then, as you've seen, pawns have been allowed to move either one or two squares on first moves. That sometimes creates a problem. A pawn moving two squares on its first move might rob an enemy pawn of a chance to capture. So, the capturing pawn moves just as it would have if the enemy pawn had moved one square instead of two. For instance, here there is no problem. The white pawn would like to move ahead, but if it does, the black pawn will be able to capture it. However, the black pawn has the same problem. If it moves ahead, the white pawn will be able to capture it. This makes it fair for both sides. But sometimes this happens. Black has moved his D pawn up 3 squares. The pawn waits, ready to do battle. But the pawn can move either 1 or 2 squares on the first move. If the white E pawn moves up 2 squares, it looks as if the black pawn will not even get a chance to capture it. Unfair, wouldn't you say? However, because of the en passant rule, the black pawn is still able to capture the white pawn in passing, en passant. The idea is that the capturing pawn moves just as it would have, even if the enemy pawn moved 1 square instead of 2. In other words, you push the pawn back 1 square, and then you take it. In order for you to be able to capture en passant, the enemy pawn must have just moved 2 squares. The pawns must also be in adjoining files, side by side, and you must capture en passant on the very next move, or you forfeit the opportunity. With a little time and practice, you should have the concept of en passant down pat. And there are your troops, the courageous pawns, the powerful rook that looks like a castle tower, the bold and nimble knights on horseback, those agile advisors, the bishops, the most powerful chess piece, the queen, and the man you must protect at all costs, the king. When setting up the pieces to play, remember that the enemy queens should be across from each other on the D file, each on a square of her own color. Here's an easy way to remember where each queen should be. The queen's dress should match her shoes. So, the white queen goes on a light square, and the black queen goes on a dark square. Or you might use the memory aid, queen on her color. The king and queen are right in the center of things. Queens on their colors and facing each other on the D file. Kings also facing each other on the E file. The bishops stand on either side of the royal pair. Knights not far away, ready to spring into action. The rooks watching from the corners of the kingdom. And in front, the pawns lined up and ready to march into battle. White always moves first, then black, then white. the players taking turns, each moving just one man on each play. Most players soon develop their own individual tactics and strategies. The favorite opening move of Bobby Fischer, considered by many as the greatest chess player of all time, is E2 to E4. This is an excellent way to start because right from the beginning, you're using your pawns to control the center of the board. Long ago when a battle began, the king stayed safely in his castle. Only when the conflict was near an end was it considered safe for the king to leave his castle and join the battle. Well, in chess, you can help to ensure your king's safety with a special move called castling. You can do it just once in a game. Most serious chess players castle in the early stages of a game. To castle, you must move your king and one rook at the same time. This is the only time when you can move two men at once. When you castle, you move your king 2 squares toward the rook. Then the rook hops over the king to the square next to the king. The move accomplishes 2 things. It safeguards the king, moving him out of the center of action, and it brings the rook into the middle files where he's ready for action. There are 2 ways to castle. You can castle with the rook closest to the king. This is the king side castling. Or with the rook closest to the queen, queen side castling. After castling queen side, there should be 2 squares between the king and the edge of the board. After castling king side, there should be 1 square between the king and the edge of the board. Important points to remember. Once either the king or the rook involved in castling have been moved, it's too late to castle. You can only castle if neither piece has been moved. All the squares between the king and the rook involved in the castling must be empty. A king cannot escape check by castling. When castling, the king can never move across a square where he would be in check. It's considered illegal to castle if the enemy controls a square through which your king would move. So castle early, protect your king, and use your rook to help control the center of the board.
Now that we've mastered the rules of chess, it's time to move on to a little strategy. There are 3 basic elements of strategy: time, space, and material. The 3 elements of strategy are all interrelated. The faster a piece can move, the more space it controls, the more powerful, the more material value it has. The pawn, having the most limited powers of movement, is the weakest piece. We value it at 1 point.
The knight moves much more quickly than the pawn and controls a great deal more space. We value it at 3 points. It has the additional strength of being able to leap over other pieces. It has the weakness of a limited range.
The bishop cannot jump other pieces like the knight can, but the bishop can move all the way across the board in a single move. The bishop's power gives it a value of 3 points.
The rook also moves the entire length of the board. It has the additional ability to control squares of both colors. We give it a value of 5.
The queen is the most powerful chess piece. She combines the movements of the rook and the bishop. We value the queen at 9 points.
The king is priceless. When you lose the king, the game is over.
In printed material, the board and chessmen look like this. By now you've been getting a handle on the basic rules and strategy of chess, and whether you realize it or not, you've also been learning how to read and write chess. This will allow you to keep written records of your own game and make it possible for you to tap into the vast library of material on chess, a library many people believe to be greater than for any other recreational activity in the world.
The system of notation that we've been using in this program is the most widely used in the world. Each north-south file has a letter name, A through H. Each east-west rank has a number name, 1 through 8. The name of each square is a letter-number combination. To record the names of the pieces, we use the first letters of their names. Except for the knight. For him, we use an N to avoid confusion with the king. No symbol is needed for the pawn. Captures are recorded using an X. Check is a plus sign. Castling kingside is written 0-0. Castling queenside is written 0-0-0. Additional symbols and sequences record procedures such as pawn promotion and, of course, each move of the game. For example, in this position, the white king on A2 could move to A1. In response, the black knight on C3 could move to capture the white rook on B1.
Right now, let's use the principles of chess notation to look at a master game, a game that will, by the way, demonstrate the damage a knight can inflict.
The following game was played between Gibaud and Lazard in the 1924 Paris Championship.
Fighting for control of the center from the very first move, white advances D2 to D4.
Black also fights for control of the center by developing the knight on G8 to F6. From the F6 square, the knight controls the key E4 square, preventing white from advancing the E pawn to E4.
White replies by developing his knight from B1 to D2, supporting the advance of the E-pawn from E2 to E4. Unfortunately, this move also blocks in the white bishop at C1 and gives up access to the knight's best square at C3.
Black now decides to offer a gambit. A gambit is an offer of a pawn for a gain of time. The black pawn on E7 moves to E5. Black sees that white can capture the pawn, but he's more interested in developing the bishop and the queen.
White accepts the gambit by capturing D4 e5, and chasing the black knight.
The black knight is worth 3 pawns, so he can't afford to give himself up for the pawn. The knight on f6 moves to safety on g4.
Nervous about the aggressive position of the knight, white decides to chase it away with a weakening pawn move from h2 to h3, expecting black to capture the pawn at e5.
The knight on g4 could move to capture the pawn on e5. But black notices that the white king is completely surrounded by his own men. Furthermore, the diagonal to the king has been weakened. The knight exploits this by moving from g4 into the hornet's nest on e3. From here, the knight attacks the white queen.
Threatened with the surrender of the queen for the knight, a loss of 6 clear points, white answers by capturing f2, e3.
If you count the pieces, you'll see that black is now behind by a knight and a pawn. But black has opened a key diagonal to the white king. Black exploits this by moving queen on d8 to h4. The queen says check along the diagonal to the white king.
Unable to either move the king out of check or to capture the checking piece, white is forced to interpose by advancing the pawn from g2 to g3.
The pawn has blocked the check, but the pawn is unprotected. The queen moves from h4 to capture on g3, again with check to the king on the diagonal. The king has no safe moves. The queen cannot be captured. The check cannot be blocked. Checkmate is the result.
To discuss the strategy of chess in more detail, here are Vince McCambridge, International Chess Master and Assistant Director of the United States Chess Federation, and Don Maddox, Editor of Chess Life, the world's best-known chess magazine.
The center is the most important part of the board. All of the chess pieces operate most effectively in the center. In general, the player who controls the center will be the ultimate winner of the game.
In the beginning of the game, in the opening, time is just about the most important thing. Every move should contribute to the development of a piece, to increase pressure on the center, and maximum efficiency.
Usually, it's better to develop your knights before your bishops. The knight has a natural opening move towards the center 2 squares forward, whereas at the beginning, you shouldn't be sure where your bishop belongs. It has a wider range and it has a wider choice of moves, so it's better to develop the knights first and then look to see where the bishop belongs.
A pin is an attack on a piece shielding a more valuable piece behind it. It creates a situation in which the movement of the first piece results in the loss of the more valuable piece that it's protecting.
In this position, look at the white rook and the white king on the same diagonal. The black bishop moves from f7 to d5 and takes advantage of the diagonal situation. The white rook is attacked by the bishop, but if the rook moves away, the bishop would take the king. As we know, you can never allow your king to be captured, so the white rook must stay where it is. The rook is lost. A fork is a simultaneous attack on two pieces. When two pieces are threatened, the opponent can only defend one, so he must lose the other.
One of the amazing things about chess is you can take the same tool that you use to create a pin by moving from F7 to D5, and in another position, win that same rook through the use of a fork, moving from D1 to F3 check. The king is forced to move. The rook is left hanging. A fork is when you use a piece to attack two other pieces simultaneously. I've taught hundreds of beginners in my time, and almost always when they get a little bit timid and they start looking for a safe move, they choose a pawn move. The problem with pawn moves is that a pawn is the only piece on the board you can't retreat with. What that means is that if you make a mistake with a pawn, you can't correct it. It's always a good idea to restrict the number of pawn moves that you make in the opening, usually limiting yourself to no more than 2, and use your moves to develop your pieces, to control the center, and to get ready to fight for the game.
It's almost always best to castle early and to castle on the king's side. Castling helps to protect your king, and it brings your rook towards the key central files. If your opponent fails to castle early, you should try to open the central files and attack his king, which can become trapped in the center.
With the exception of the king, the queen is the most vulnerable piece on the board. Beginners often think that an early attack with the queen is the proper way to play. But the truth of the matter is that once you get the queen into the center of the board, where she's vulnerable to attack, you end up playing soccer. Your queen is the ball, and quite often the game is in the balance.
The single most important piece of chess strategy is to always be careful with your king. Remember that if you lose your king, you lose the game. So before you think to grab a pawn or another piece, ask yourself, does my opponent have a threat against my king? The key strategy tips are to control the center, to develop your minor pieces rapidly in the opening of the game, to develop your knights before bishops, watch for pin possibilities in your games, watch for forks, restrict yourself to no more than 2 pawn moves in the opening. This is important. Remember to castle early. Be careful with your queen. Don't play with the queen too early in the game. And be extra careful with your king.
Chess. Always new, always different and intriguing, and in many ways, as you will see, much more than a game. Before each game, the players shake hands and wish each other good luck. During the game, they're quiet and try not to disturb their opponents. When the game is over, win, lose, or draw, they shake hands again and thank each other for a good match. You know, even losing is not so bad, because your captured pieces can all return to play in the next game. Competitive game, sure, but also a friendly game. So every time you play chess with someone new, it's an opportunity to make a new friend. With some practice, you can be well on your way toward mastering chess, meeting new friends, and looking forward to a lifetime of enjoyment. For Don Maddox and Vince McCambridge, this is David Mathau wishing you good luck next time you go off in pursuit of a king.
If you'd like more information about chess notation or the game of chess in general, you're invited to contact the United States Chess Federation. A wide selection of instructional books and chess computers are available, designed for students of all ages. Chess computers make excellent practice partners, are always available, and offer adjustable levels of challenge. We'll also be happy to tell you how you can participate in Chess by Mail activities. Plug into the LeisureLink Chess by Computer modem network and participate in chess tournaments that welcome and are open to everyone who loves the game. A not-for-profit organization, the United States Chess Federation publishes Chess Life, the world's leading chess magazine. In Pursuit of a King has been an educational presentation of the United States Chess Federation. This is Doug Cole speaking.